It was not. Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of our TGI Monday Challenge. Today we have with us a special guest who was invited by Salim Ismail 3 weeks ago to talk about a fascinating topic. In fact, to talk about the dichotomy, abundance versus scarcity. Our guest today is Jerry Michalski, and he's been studying the connections between abundance and scarcity for over 20 years. So he's definitely an expert on the subject. Jerry, thank you for accepting Salim's invitation and being with us today.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's go straight to the point and put an end to the mystery. What's this connection between abundance and scarcity?
So I started realizing this when I was studying the educational system and how it seems it just came up over and over again that we were doing stupid things when in a moment of abundance, like you could learn math from anybody almost. You could, almost anybody can be a teacher, almost anything can be an object to learn from. You could learn at any time, etc. We had created an institution where if you were curious about math during English class, you were a troublemaker. And I was like, there's something just really broken about this. And I then figured out that the education system systematically creates scarcity where there could be abundance. And then later on, as I thought about it more, just to evolve the whole thought, I realized that when you create a control system to an institution that controls everybody, to try to control behavior, to prevent bad actors, what you've also done is you've lopped off the genius that's in the room. You've sort of prevented people from really jumping in where their energy and their skills and their connections and everything make the most sense in sort of an open space kind of setting. Instead, you're going to try to test everybody to go through at the same time. And so it's not just that scarcity kills abundance, but it killed genius as well. And that I found to be really sad. And then I looked around and I discovered that, wow, we're doing this all over the place. We've basically stopped trusting people. And so the equation that came to me was a scarcity equals abundance minus trust, because in many cases, you have pre-existing abundance. And what you do is you create a system where you don't trust people anymore that then institutes a form of scarcity. And this plays out kind of, in market after market around the world. And that led me back towards sort of originally, how did we live, right? And there's this notion that life long ago was short. We lived short lives, that we were hungry and we were sort of starving and walking around the landscape. And I have a completely different idea that over the years, we figured out how to live well with the landscape, sculpting the landscape to create abundance on the landscape, right? And I can point to books and things like that to say that. Then we systematically destroyed that, replacing it with a series of institutions and models that gave me that MacBook Pro that I'm talking with you through right now, but also created all sorts of planetary crises, including trust crises.
Okay, well, so it's very interesting, the way you framed it mathematically, right? Scarcity equals abundance minus trust, meaning that if you have a lot of abundance, but you don't have trust, scarcity equals abundance. So that's very counterintuitive, right? That lack of trust can kill abundance. You can, the sense of abundance actually disappears no matter how much you have. Actually, the more you have, the more you feel a scarcity if there's no trust. That's the idea.
There's also different people's definitions or measures of abundance, right? So capitalism does yield a kind of abundance. Like you go into a store and there's just stuff. I would go, walk through the floor of Macy's, one of the big department stores, or El Corte Inglés, and you see row after row of ugly clothes mostly. And it's like, wow, somebody's really sewing a lot of clothes. There's an abundance of stuff, right? And at the other end, there are people who are not making enough to make a living. And all over the place, we're busy depleting the Earth's resources. And I think part of what conscious capitalism is trying to do is inject a sense of the commons and community back in to capitalism, which capitalists have done their very best, and they've done a very good job of evacuating all those things from capitalism. They basically said, nope, we're going to pump out all of the notions that capitalists are responsible for anything besides making a profit. And regulators are supposed to regulate so that making a profit doesn't hurt everything. And then all we need to do is make that profit. And that has become this dominant framework that has led us into a world of perceived abundance, and yet like all sorts of scarcities at every end of this very complicated ecosystem.
That's a very interesting view. In fact, I would, now that you're talking about capitalism, I would like to bring money into your equation. According to paleontologist David Graeber, ancient tribes didn't have money. They essentially operated on trust. And reciprocity was based on the notion that no matter how much I gave to the community, I would always get more in exchange. So trust and moral codes were kind of the building blocks of an invisible fabric that articulated the collaboration between tribe members. The problem is that as tribes got bigger, trust got thinner. And that's when money came to the rescue. So money actually, in a way, made trust obsolete, and at the same time replaced the networks of trust and moral codes that articulated human collaboration by a new network of economic interests. Is that how we started creating a world of mistrust and scarcity out of a world of abundance?
I'm not sure that's the origins of the way I'm looking at it, but it's clearly one of the major factors. And I love Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. It's brilliant. And the first thing he does is he destroys the myth of barter. He says, and I have an econ undergrad, which I don't trust worth anything. It's like when we got rid of externalities in about half an hour, I remember sitting there. I was a bit younger then. I remember sitting there going, wait, that sounded important. How did we just dispense with that? In a little like, oh, and then there's this and then there's that. Don't worry about it. Assume a normal distribution. I'm like, wait, what happened? So, and then we're so deep into capitalist life with everything having a price that we can't imagine other ways of doing it. So we have this weird false dichotomy of it's capitalism or socialism or communism, and those are the only choices, and look how terrible these were. And in the Algonquin tribes, for example, in the American Northeast, any surplus, whatever was hunted or gathered or raised, was put in longhouses, and the elder women of each tribe would dispense it to whoever needed it. And then one of my favorite books is The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi. And he talks about the transformation into the industrial economy and industrial society. And he says that before that happened, we used to stay alive through householding, redistribution, and reciprocity. And householding means behind your hut, you've planted some potatoes and you've got a goose and whatever, and your neighbors just slaughtered their pig. And the idea that anybody's going to go hungry because they don't have a job is like doesn't exist before 1650. It's a new concept when the Industrial Revolution comes in and takes over, and when money comes in and takes over. So all these things were working kind of together, and in a weird way ate our brains. And there's a series of scripts in our heads about Homo economicus, which organizations like conscious capitalism are now trying to pry loose a little bit by humanizing them, by sprinkling a little bit of reality on them, by trying to say, hey, people, this thing we programmed into us has been hurting us for a long time, even as it gave us apparent abundance. Can we fix it? So, and then you also say, as tribes got bigger, we sort of lost the ability to exchange stuff. Well, everything is kind of fractal. Like neighborhoods today still take care of each other. I don't think size is a problem here. Yeah. One of the three words I've heard kill more good ideas are, it won't scale. We have this engineering mentality about scale where, and why money is an absolute necessity, et cetera, is because otherwise, how would it scale? How would anything scale? Well, it turns out that if neighborhoods could feed themselves, not worrying about money, but let's say we had urban farming in high tech and low tech, we had really healthy soil in the neighborhoods, but also vertical farming with their, aquaponics and whatnot, chances are they wouldn't need to spend money on food very much. And then money becomes less interesting, less useful, right? But then they're outside the economy, and we hate that. Because one of the things Polanyi also says is that market economy requires market society. So basically, market systems, capitalist systems, are like a cuckoo chick. Cuckoos are brood parasites. Cuckoo birds do not raise their young, they lay their eggs in some other bird's nests. So the wren or the robin wakes up and goes, or comes back to the nest and goes, well, my junior's grown a lot, and feeds it. And the first instinct of a cuckoo chick is to push everything else out of the nest. And that's what capitalism does. Capitalism can't tolerate other equitable, non-monetary forms of life actually surviving.
But it's interesting because you said that at some point, the inertia of capitalism can take us to a world where money actually becomes less relevant. And in fact, I think that's true of almost everything in life. You can always look at the same reality from multiple different angles and see the same reality completely different. And I remember in our talk with Salim 3 weeks ago, he was arguing that despite a lot of the issues that money has, money was actually, in fact, one of the issues is that probably it created this sense of scarcity, as you were kind of describing before. But at the same time, money was a great tool. Money was a great tool for taking us out of scarcity and bringing in abundance, which is where we seem to be heading. So do you think that as technology takes us to this new world of abundance, you just said before that money becomes less relevant. Do you think that it will eventually become completely unnecessary, that trust could become the new currency in the future?
Well, so much of this depends on the social contract, right? If we manage to use exponential technologies and create abundance all over the place, such that we have fully automated luxury communism, or FALC is like a movement out there. If our social contract is that if you don't have a job and make an income, you can't buy food or have shelter, then we're kind of hosed, because as people get unemployed by automation, they won't have a place to go or a thing to do. If we manage to renegotiate the social contract, which is a very important thing, we have to sort of fix the American dream, and I'm talking here from an American perspective, but the American dream has kind of infected many other countries. And we have to fix the social contract to be more humane. Then we have a world where the abundance generated through technological innovations could be fantastic for everybody, right? We're looking at cellular food at this point, where we no longer would have to kill animals, to eat them. Peak horse was 1919 because it got replaced by the internal combustion engine. Maybe we're looking at peak cow, pig, and chicken. That'd be awesome, right? And that would be good for the environment, to be good for a lot of things. It would be bad for some companies.
Right, and that's the problem.
Yeah, eternally, because it's really weird that a few companies seem to have inordinate control over policy and politics, right? And so for me, the important battle is over those scripts in our heads, the little things like I was taught in business school that scarcity equals value. That's like a given. It's like it's a given, right? And I don't believe that's true. But capitalism doesn't work without scarcity. In capitalism, you kind of have to create scarcity if there isn't any. And all of that is buried real deep inside everybody's heads. Capitalism can still work on abundance. And open source software is a nice example of that.
Right. So when we talk about abundance, of course, there's abundance could be abundance of everything. There are a lot of things that could be abundant. But I think that as long as we had abundance of whatever covers our basic needs for survival, like food, energy, communications, and health, and a few more things, would be fine with that. So probably we could only need money for everything else that's additional to covering our basic needs. But if we had that covered, the basic needs covered, then we would probably be much more comfortable in dealing with situations like the current one, right? I mean, if today one of the things that the coronavirus has shown us is that it's very easy for biological technology to shut down our entire economy overnight. What we've discovered and we didn't know is that we don't know how to turn it back up, like we turn on a computer. And probably if we had something like UBI, Universal Basic Income, we would be able to do that because we would simply wait until the crisis is over. Nobody would suffer along the way, and we'd be back in business whenever it was possible to go back in business. Mm-hmm. So what's your take on UBI? How do you connect that with your vision?
Well, ironically, and we're in the middle of this crazy American electoral campaign right now, right? With the hope that there's going to be an election in November. And ironically, the policies of Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders, let's see, universal basic income and Medicare for all, seem to be pointedly needed right now. And like this whole pandemic has said, like, wow, there was an article 2 days ago that I read about how hospitals are in deep, deep, deep trouble because nobody's going to hospitals for normal procedures. And many hospitals are losing money trying to serve COVID patients, but regular hospitals are just bleeding themselves dry. Let's see. If we had a national healthcare system, that wouldn't be a concern, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these like beautiful and poignant ironies about how we're looking at things. And it's possible, not probable, that the way this crisis has been handled in the US, which has been particularly stupid, we have record unemployment numbers because companies had to furlough people. Companies were encouraged to sort of get rid of people and skinny down so that everybody could apply for unemployment, but these people are now unemployed. And the idea that when we can press the green light, everybody suddenly goes back to their old employer, gets their old job and starts going again, that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen easily. In other countries where they basically supplemented people's incomes and told companies, don't fire everybody. Like we will match for a couple months. We can do this as a country. We will match people's incomes, their salaries, so that they can in fact go back to their jobs and pick up where they were. I think that the resuming, hitting pause and resume, the resume will be much easier in those countries. But in the U.S. we've been particularly stupid on 12 different fronts, which means to me that this is going to be just a really traumatic experience for the U.S. in particular. And trauma opens opportunities for deep change of the kind that we would like to see.
And actually, this is a great point because obviously this kind of simulation we've done would have been absolutely impossible hadn't it been because of we were forced into it by a virus. But the great thing is that now all countries have had to take measures to to deal with the situation. And now, once this is over, we'll be able to check who did best and actually learn something out of it and implement those. Whoever did best should become the best practice for everyone else in the future. Hopefully, we'll see. Talking about that, in the current situation, do you think that trust could actually be one of the most powerful weapons to fight crises like the current one?
I think it always is, and we just underestimate it because we're very convinced that things like the tragedy of the commons are true and that nobody's trustworthy. But worse, we're at a moment right now where trust has been weaponized and is intentionally being undermined by mostly people on the alt-right and far right. They've done really deep and intelligent analyses of how social dynamics work, how trust works, all these sorts of things. And they've discovered that if you can undermine faith in science, journalism, government itself, and one another, that you can win elections. And we're seeing this in the rise of the far right worldwide. Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, you name it, right? We have to actually resort to trust at a moment of particularly low trust, where trust is a weapon in the arena. This is by far not the lowest trust moment on earth, by far. Like, we're sitting here having a conversation. I trust you. I think you trust me. We're expressing ideas openly, and I don't think that any moment the door is going to be broken down. Right? This is not Stasi East Germany. This is not a whole bunch of things. And then I'll point out that in the former East Germany, it was extremely low trust up here, but there were high trust networks underground, which is how you got like a doctor's actual help, how you got better food, how you got an education for your kids. And these were incredibly high trust bonds because if you were exposed, it was very dangerous. So a situation that looks low trust doesn't necessarily read low trust all the way through. There are all sorts of sub things going on in any society.
And actually, to your point, I think we have very good examples of how the countries that have been able to leverage trust are doing better than others. We have the example of Sweden, right, where actually probably it's a not so common situation, because Sweden is a country kind of a special, characterized by very high levels of trust. It's not that the trust is just between people, but also between people and government institutions. And that's kind of unusual, because that's kind of the opposite of what happens elsewhere. But at least we've been able to see that without taking dramatic measures, they've been able to face the situation and stand up.
And also, I mean, Singapore, I would say, is a high trust in government kind of place as well. But they went into lockdowns. Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and in some measure China, really learned lessons from the SARS virus back when. They were hit very hard by SARS, and they realized, okay, we have to respond very quickly in a pandemic and track and trace and isolate and do the whole thing, as opposed to Sweden. So Sweden used its trust and said to its people, hey, behave intelligently. Separate, do this, do that. And Sweden, I've got a little bit deeper analysis on it, but Sweden was really stupid about protecting elders. Basically, they did not do nearly enough to protect old people in nursing homes and elder care facilities and so forth. And so many of their deaths are there. And then also they did not do nearly enough to the non-homogeneous part of the population, because Swedes are healthy. They were good candidates for working through this, but they have immigrant communities that they didn't pay attention to. So those are hotspots. So again, it's all in the details, but it is fascinating, as you said a moment ago, that so many countries have taken such different approaches to responding to the pandemic, from which, if we're lucky and the stats are trustworthy, and that's a big if, we'll be able to learn a lot of lessons later and process this back into, okay, good. So what should we do given what our culture is? Because I do think that trust is the way out here. But when you've been systematically undermining it, and half the population believes that, Obama has a forked tail, I don't know, like that's a difficult thing to do.
So I guess, I think that the US, where you live, would be the counterexample of Sweden, because in Sweden, everybody trusts everybody and the government. And in the US, there's a growing level of mistrust towards the government, and populism is really taking over. And actually, the problem is that it seems to be infectious, because it's not just the US that populism is taking over, it's also elsewhere. Do you see a connection between populism and mistrust?
Well, for sure. I'll just type into the chat, are contagious as well. There we go. So mistrust and populism are completely contagious. We're talking about a virus here. Forget the virus. Before the virus showed up and locked us all down, we were busy using methods of contagion and methods sort of, viruses also are by analogy. We talk about computer viruses, but we also talk about memes as viruses. And something went viral is an idea or a funny GIF or whatever else went viral. And so populism has gone viral. And just from my own perspective, there were a whole lot of people who didn't see any good prospects for themselves or their children, and they were justifiably angry at the status quo in ways that conscious capitalism is trying to fix, right? These people, for them, the normal progressive parties in each of their countries weren't doing enough, and the European Union wasn't doing enough, and the institutions that were also working from this sort of scarcity mentality and this paternalistic approach, they were not thinking really very broadly, none of them that I can tell. So they rose up against them and said, no, we're just going to vote for these populist people. And that's working. And it's working partly because there's a whole bunch of people undermining trust so that it will be weaponized, so it'll be even more active, so that those people will turn up and vote. It's not a world I particularly want, but modern power in these days, and I did a series of videos about Donald Trump and modern power. Trump seemed to me in the 2016 election cycle in the US to be the only politician who understood modern power, which meant owning the video screen for 3 days at a time by doing something so horrible that everybody was in a froth over it. But when you're in a froth, you're basically disabled, right? And we're nearing the end of our call, and I see Anna asked a really good question in the chat. Should we turn to that?
Yes. Yeah. Let's. I was planning to open the Q&A session in a minute, but I think that this is a good moment. So Berta, could you actually go over the questions in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jerry. So
Hello.
we have Anne's question for the moment, and she asks, how can companies build trust with their employees at all levels of the organization?
It's a great question. And there's a huge movement called workplace democracy that's been trying really hard for a very long time to get people to trust their employees and to figure out how do you run companies. There's also some smaller, more experimental things like holacracy and sociocracy and so forth, which are also attempts to decentralize power and control and create different kinds of decision-making models. So I think that workplace democracy, broadly spoken, and I look at Ricardo Semler at Semco in Brazil as a brilliant example of this, and his book Maverick is really good. But there's a whole lot of other examples of companies doing this in different ways. And when you trust your employees, like the genius shows up, the genius in the room can show up. It's really interesting. Then separately, vulnerability, if you listen to Brene Brown, who is mostly talking about human relationships, right? She says that vulnerability is the path to authentic connection and joy. I completely agree. I think this is also true of companies. I think that everything, and if you read Brene's book, Daring Greatly, she actually scales it to companies. She talks about institutions as well. And that's really important because companies, I did an exercise long ago where I asked people, I said, okay, you're a CEO, tell me what vulnerability means. And everybody posted it for a while, and then we put them up and talked about them. And then I said, okay, set that aside. And then I said, you're in a couple, you're in a relationship, and tell me what vulnerability means. And everybody posted it, and we put them up, and then we compared the two. And for couples, vulnerability was like authenticity, love, meaning, connection. And for companies, it was disaster, peril, danger. And I'm like, this is wrong, right? We actually need to think about vulnerability, corporate vulnerability, as being an important way to build trust at all levels, including with the outside world. Part of the problem is many companies have really ugly skeletons hiding in their closets. They've done some very nasty things over time that they're not that proud of. And how you bring those skeletons out may require truth and reconciliation commissions. I don't know, but we have to figure out some large ways of winning and earning trust again with outside constituencies, with the other stakeholders besides employees.
That question actually leads us nicely to what was going to be my next question, which is a question we always ask all our guests, which is, what's your vision of conscious capitalism? How do you think businesses can contribute to coming out of crisis like this? And how do you think businesses should change in the future going forward?
So I think it's weird. Like I tell the story of IBM saving itself by adopting open source software, which is a form of abundance that requires not holding and owning the software, but participating in communities of high trust, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole nice story behind it. And IBM proceeded to make billions of dollars in service revenues on top of open source software, right? And then companies that are growing or raising food are realizing that if they change their methods to regenerative agriculture, permaculture, et cetera, the soil is actually better after each cycle, and they don't have to buy pesticides, and and there's story after story I could tell about that. And you can kind of look at sector after sector and go, wow, if we just changed our attitudes, A, things get cheaper, B, outcomes are as good or better, and C, you actually are more trustworthy because you no longer have to perform the things you were doing before that were completely untrustworthy, like advertising. Advertising is the stalker economy. Advertising is the foundational revenue streams for Facebook and all these mega tech corporations, right? I don't really like being stalked. There's not a real particular reason why. I mean, they could charge a fee and probably their numbers would be a lot lower. That's what would happen, right? But you could pay for the service. So a whole bunch of people are trying to figure out, how do we decentralize this? How do we create a decentralized web? How do we create decentralized apps that allow us to control our identity, all of that. So the trust onion unpeels in so many interesting and complicated directions.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I guess if there are no more questions from the audience, we're going to have to leave it here. But before that, we're going to ask you our final question, which is, who would you like us to invite to our next session? Why, and what kind of question would you like to ask?
Sure. So my candidate is Courtney Martin, who is a journalist and author. She wrote The New Better Off, Reinventing the American Dream. She is a third wave feminist, I guess. And partly Partly, I think that feminist economics of different kinds, ecofeminism and so forth, are incredibly informative, as are anarchism and other sorts of things that we've managed to demonize and set aside earlier. And so I'd love to invite her into this string of conversations to bring those points of view to bear here, and to say, for example, what is the role of feminism in capitalism? It's a good starting point, and I think she'd have a lot to say about it.
Sounds like a great question and a great guest. Thank you very much, and we'll make sure we reach out to her.
Cool.
Good. So before we go, is there any closing statement, any final remark that you would like to make?
Yeah, briefly. I started my journey 25 years ago when I realized I didn't like the word consumer, because when I'm being treated as a mere consumer, it's a breach of trust. I'm a human with a whole bunch of different needs and goals and whatever, but as a consumer, I'm just a gullet with a wallet and some eyeballs to condition me to go buy more stuff I don't really need. But that's what capitalism has become. Capitalism's kind of in this dark alley that made a few people extremely wealthy, so that's why we're in that dark alley. And capitalism could be fixed and moved into other configurations that treat us well, that treat the earth well, that respect our privacy, that do all these nifty things, which sound at this point like idealistic babble. Which don't need to be, because we're right at the cusp of possibly having these things. So to me, trust is a linchpin, that if we figure out trust, we can actually work our way back toward much more humane forms of this particular social arrangement, and we can maybe fix the social contract as well.
Well, I think you just described conscious capitalism from the angle of trust. So thank you very much for your insights, Jerry. It's been a pleasure interviewing you. And thanks again for being with us today. I also want to thank our audience and remind you that we're going to post the video of this recording on YouTube, and that the next session, next Monday, will be with Christine Engvik. She is the founder of the Women International Networking Conference, and we'll be talking with her about the role of women in business, which is kind of also the same topic that Jerry was suggesting, but I'm sure that they will complement each other fantastically. So hope to see you next Monday again. And Jerry, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.